Hello, hello. Welcome to our book discussion. We're just going to wait for people to enter the chat. When you're here, tell us hello, check in, say hi, tell me what you're reading. Obviously, we're all going to be here to discuss this wonderful book. I thought it was wonderful. It ends with us by Colleen Hoover. And obviously, Sahar loves it too because it's one of her favorite books of the year. So we're just going to go around and introduce ourselves, and then we'll go ahead and jump into the book discussion. So, hi, I'm Haley. Haley Hughes is my channel. You're on it right now. So if you know me, I'm here, like you're here, like you know me. So I am qualified to have this discussion as a therapist because I am that. That is like my day job. If you guys don't know that, that's what I do. So hello, I'm a therapist. I'm not officially licensed, but when I do get my license, I will have what's called an LPC. So that stands for Licensed Professional Counselor. Right now, I'm on my last semester of grad school, so I'm almost there, almost to my provisionary license, and I am supervised by Reem Glasgow, who is an LPC supervisor. So everything is in check. That is my kind of licensing deal right now. And Emily is in the same program as I am. She has a little bit of a different license though, so I'll let her introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about that.
Hi, y'all. So what Haley said, I am also a therapist, but my license will be LMFT, which stands for Licensed Marriage Family Therapist. So kind of like the same thing as Haley, just like viewing things in like a little bit of a different lens. I am also supervised. His name is Doc Davis, LPC. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
And then Sahar is here to ask us questions and facilitate the discussion. Do you want to introduce yourself, Queen?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sahar. I also have a channel called Basically Bookish Reads. I'm not licensed. I have 0 qualifications. I'm an accounting student, so I have nothing to do with this. But I loved the book, and I have questions, so I'm here to ask. But y'all in the chat better be active too, because I don't have that many.
Yes, please, if you have questions in the chat, please feel free to ask. If you need us to kind of explain terms that we say, because me and Emily can talk in pretty clinical language sometimes. If you need something explained or you don't know what a term means, please feel free to ask in the chat and we will do our best to answer. But before we get into questions, let's just go around and say kind of our impressions of the book, a general review, if you will. I personally gave this book 5 stars. I absolutely loved this book, not even as a romance, although I did love the romance, but just Lily, our main character's journey, figuring out who she is as a person and her own self-growth and development and healing, and kind of facing the things that she doesn't want to face about herself and living in that reality. I really liked that storyline, but also the romance. Like, can we just take a moment? Both romance storylines, I was fully invested in. Even the one with Ryle, although it was abusive. Also, by the way, we're going to be going into spoilers. I'm pretty sure that was obvious. Make sure you have read the book because we're going into spoilers. But the abusive relationship and her relationship with Atlas, which was kind of like the secondary plot line until the end, I was invested in both stories, and yeah, I absolutely loved it. I have almost nothing bad to say about this book.
Yeah, I agree with Haley. This was one of the first books I read this summer, and it's one of my favorites I've read. And what Haley said, I loved both of the relationships Lily got into. I especially loved, reading her journals from Atlas, like when they were In high school, that was just so sweet. I also did love Ryle. I think you want to like him. I think Colleen really like makes it where it's like, oh, like he just has a temper or whatever. And yeah, and then I just love like Lily's whole journey, just like stuff that happened in her childhood, and then her independence. She was very an independent woman in my eyes, and yeah, I just loved reading it.
I kind of have like pretty similar thoughts as both Haley and Emily. I also gave it 5 stars. I absolutely love it. It was such a ride. I loved how the story was told, like Emily was saying, with the little like journal entries and kind of seeing how she was raised through her own like personal voice was really interesting, and seeing her relationship with Atlas from when they were younger and how that kind of progressed into later in life was so meaningful. And yeah, with Ryle, like till the very end, and even now, I don't want to hate him. Like it's so hard for you to hate him because it's not like how it was with her dad, and the way he was portrayed as an abuser himself. It felt very different, even though it was still abuse nonetheless. And I think that was kind of the point Colleen Hoover, in a way, was trying to discuss, that it doesn't always like look a certain way, and it sucks, but it's there, and you have to kind of accept it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. When I first heard I don't know if it's necessarily a spoiler, but kind of like the trigger warning that there was going to be physical abuse in this book. And then I heard about, the first chapter of reading through her journal where you're witnessing her parents' abuse or her mom's abuse at the hands of her dad. I thought that was it. Like that was what the trigger was for. So I did not see Ryle snapping. Like I did not see that coming. Although I feel like looking back, I almost should have. Like the very first time they're meeting, he's like beating up a chair. And that did give me pause. Like that gave me bad vibes. I'm like, okay, this man's on a roof kicking a chair very aggressively. Maybe not the best guy to like fall in love with, but whatever. And as they got into that relationship, I was like, oh God, I really misjudged Ryle. Now I'm really liking him. And it seems like, they're going to be a great couple. And I thought the story was going to be like her grieving this past first love that she never got over while she was giving herself to Ryle. But it ended up being so much more than that. So yeah, I absolutely loved it. Let us know in the chat what your rating is if you have read this book and if you liked it. If you haven't, just let us know. And with that, Sahar, what is your first question for us?
Oh my gosh, I was not prepared to just jump right in. Hold on, I gotta pull it up.
You're totally good.
Okay, so kind of tying into what I was saying earlier about how, at least kind of from what I've seen and done research on myself, there's like a lot of different ways abuse can kind of play out and can actually happen. So were there any like commonalities y'all saw in the book that you think it did well, or maybe it did poorly, or just things that you kind of noticed were common in abusive relationships that happened in the book, both with oh no.
Emily's Wi-Fi is on the fritz. She's going to try to get back in here.
Oh no.
Let me make sure she has the link. Okay, go ahead and ask your question and I'll answer it, and then Emily can give her take when she's back in.
But yeah, just things that you kind of noticed that were common throughout abusive relationships that we kind of saw both with Lily and then also her mom and her dad.
That is a great question, because I think like what you said earlier, seeing such different forms of abusive relationships with Lily and Ryle, and then between her parents as well, it is so different the way that it plays out. And there's really not a stereotypical profile that you can create of this is an abusive partner, because Lily's dad is so different from Ryle. Ryle has, you know, his own aggression problems and past trauma that's contributing to his outbursts. And then I think Lily's father was dealing with more alcoholism and stuff like that. But as for the signs, that's something that, you know, we're all told about. I think like middle school, when you have like that big talk, like you have the assembly of, you know, make sure your friends aren't in an abusive relationship. This is what you should look for. That's all not necessarily there. You know, the biggest thing that we're told to look for is the separation and isolation from friends and family. And with Ryle, he was very gung-ho about meeting Lily's mom and, you know, connecting her to his sister. And I love that relationship that she had with Ryle's sister. So I mean, that really wasn't there, although it did seem like it was there for Lily's mother. But I think the signs that were shown that were common between Lily and her mom in both of their relationships were much more covert. They weren't things that outsider perspectives maybe would pick up on, because it was all the internal signs that maybe only a therapist would pick up on. Like if Lily had a therapist and she was talking about her relationship, that would be something that I would definitely pick up on, you know, the justifying his behaviors, the convincing herself that this is okay, and that because Ryle's behavior differs from the way that her father behaved when she was growing up, that means it's okay and it's justifiable. And that really takes a toll on a woman's self-worth. I've seen clients before that have been in domestic abuse situations, and that is very real. I think that's something that Colleen Hoover did amazingly. And you can really tell, especially from the author's note, the deep experience that she has seeing abuse and seeing that justification. So that is what I saw. Emily is having trouble getting back in. Let me help her get back in. And in the meantime, let's look at the chat. Laura is here. She hasn't read it, but hello. We have a 5-star, another fellow 5-star in the chat. Thank you, Laura. Okay, this is very true. I think, you know, based on the age and the place where you are in life when you read this book, will have a big impact. I think if I read this in high school, I don't know how I would have connected to it, but it will be interesting to read it, you know, later in life on a reread. I think I might pick up on more if I was looking from a more analytical lens rather than just purely entertainment.
Yeah.
Emily is on her way. Thank you, Laura. You're so sweet. This is a great question as well. And Sahar, you can answer this, obviously, too. This isn't necessarily like a mental health question. I don't know how I felt about that sentiment, honestly. Oh, here's Emily.
Hi, sorry.
Back.
I don't know what happened. I was like, okay, bye.
No, you're totally fine. So we have a chat question, and then we can go back and you can give your answer, like full therapist answer to the first one. But what did y'all think of the "there's no such thing as bad people, only people who do bad things" sentiment? That was kind of a theme.
Ooh. I think my personal opinion, I mean, I guess like I agree with it to an extent, but I also look at like, people that obviously are like, like murder serial killers, okay? It's like I feel like repeatedly doing bad things like that, or like even like looking into like abuse or whatever, that can make you into a bad person, if you're going to repeatedly do an act, obviously you can't really just be like, oh, like I'm still a good person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I kind of like agree with that because in my head, like when I read that, I immediately turn it the other way of like there aren't any good people, only people who do good things. And we wouldn't ever, at least I wouldn't ever go around saying that there are just no good people in the world. Like only people who are doing good things, right? So I think that there is like a fine line. And I liked what you said, Emily, about if you're like repeatedly doing these actions, then you're passing the point of you're someone who's just doing bad things. Like you are at a certain point just a bad person. So that's kind of my take on it.
That's so interesting that you guys have that take, because mine, I thought we were all going to agree, and mine's like totally not that.
I knew it because I saw your face when I was like saying, you were like, uh-huh.
No, like we definitely do not think about this the same way. My mind goes to like the nature versus nurture kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone is born a bad person. Even if you're born with a psychological disorder that means that you favor aggressive responses and you have no empathy, I still don't think that that makes you a bad person. Maybe that's a fault of my own conditioning, that I want to see the best in everyone and find empathy in my heart for all people. But I don't know. I think there are great people in this world that do really horrible things. And I think I have trouble even saying like there could be a horrible person that's just inherently bad. Like I think your patterns are shaped by the way that you're conditioned, the way that you're raised, and that can shape you into, falling into negative patterns or harmful patterns that hurt the people around you. But I just still see that piece of like having empathy for the horrible things people have been through that put them into those harmful patterns, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
A few bad eggs. Okay, yeah, I can see that. Like Ted Bundy, probably a bad egg.
Yeah, absolutely.
Danny says there's bad people. T. That's very true. Yeah, that's kind of like the nurture thing.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a little bit more clarification. Not that these people are born bad, but you can become a bad person through your
Yeah, I definitely don't think anyone's born like a bad person, and no one's born a good person. You're just kind of, you come into this world, and like you said, Haley, like the nature versus nurture thing is very true. Just how you've been raised and like who you're surrounded by, and just everything, literally every person, thing, environment, everything around you affects how you're gonna end up in the future.
Yeah. And it's crazy how the same set of like nurture circumstances can affect different people in wildly different ways, like just depending on the way that you're wired. Like someone can grow up in an abusive environment and that can make them, go in the complete opposite of what their parents do. And that is kind of defined as post-traumatic growth, the opposite of PTSD, where you see this horrible thing and you go through this really traumatic experience to where you learn how to overcome that and not fall into that pattern. However, that is more rare than the occurrence of PTSD, where those patterns come out in a more negative way. So going back to the first question, it was about the signs of abuse and how Colleen Hoover brought those across. Let me know what you think about that one, Emily.
Okay, signs of abuse. I think, to me, like, I would have to, like, really, because I couldn't see it coming. I did not see this man is going to hit her. Right. However, I do think a typical sign or a common sign was after it happened, like, she immediately went to, I'm comparing this to my past history with my family. He is not my father, you know, and then just justifying the situations, which is what is pretty common in, I think, abusive relationships. It's just that aspect of, like, I don't want to believe this, like, you know, or it's one time where I did something to make him mad. And I mean, and Lily even says, like, why, I don't know, I think she says towards the end, I think, is kind of like, you know, why do people always question why the woman stays and never why the man does it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that is such a common theme that is portrayed in domestic abuse. But I'm trying to think of other instances. I think the whole, like, him doing it and immediately apologizing, obviously, until the last time, like, he knew, like, oh, like, I messed up, you know, I need to give her space. But yeah, the immediately, like, apologizing and which allows her, I think, yeah, because it's very typical of them, of, like, victims to now be like, oh, well, you know, this was just a one-time thing, right? And that's what I think brought Lily into, like, well, my dad abused my mom frequently, right? Ryle has only done this because I made him mad, you know? And so I think that's, like, where I see the commonality.
Yeah, for sure. I had a really similar answer, so I feel like we're wrong.
Really? Okay.
The justification is just so difficult, especially because there's, like, a block in your brain when somebody has been your protector, your support. Especially, it's a little bit different in heterosexual relationships rather than LGBT relationships, because you have this very masculine and feminine energy that is enforced by societal norms and all of that, where the man is supposed to protect you, and you can fall into that heteronormative kind of view of gender roles really easily in a straight relationship. So when you feel like this man is supposed to protect me and I live with him now and we're engaged now, you kind of give a piece of yourself to him, and it's easier to feel very threatened when that's not the case. You don't want to believe that, because that would mean that your protection is no longer there and you're no longer safe. Mm-hmm. You're welcome, Chelsea. It was a great question. Yes, I really liked that too, that they on the outside seemed so perfect. Even to what's Ryle's sister's name?
Alyssa.
Yeah, even to Alyssa, like, she was completely caught off guard when Lily disclosed the abuse to her. Mm-hmm. That's very true as well. Mm-hmm. Keeping up that perfect image is really important to an abuser. I don't think Ryle was doing that consciously in this case, but definitely in some cases, like, this reminds me of Behind Closed Doors by B.A. Paris. The way that abuse is shown in that book, it's very much like Jack needed Grace to be perfect at all times. And if she wasn't, then she would get punished.
I was thinking, like, the exact same thing. Like, that book came to my mind as soon as I read that, because that literally, that's what it was. Just him making it seem like they had it all together, and that everything was perfect and their entire lives are perfect and everything kind of fit together. And that's when you kind of know something's probably up.
Right. Especially if it seems like all your needs are met from the outside. Like, okay, he's taking care of me. I have food on the table. He's providing me with vacations and this nice apartment and all of these things. it's a lot easier to justify staying in that and enduring the abuse. All right, what's your next question? Throw a tough one at us.
Okay, well, one of them kind of mentioned or kind of answered already, but I want to like kind of go more into it. So Haley, you were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and then post-traumatic growth. And I wanted to kind of hear more about that, on how people who've kind of been raised in an environment where, a parent abused the other, and how that kind of mentally affects what that person will do later on in life and how they kind of cope with that.
That's a hard one because, I asked for it, but so many people can be affected in different ways. There is a pattern that especially women can fall into when they witness abuse. It becomes a cycle that they find themselves in that position unintentionally, and it can be in a very different way. And I think Colleen Hoover did a great job of showing that. But I think that happens because a lot of what we're modeled when we're growing up, we just unconsciously act out. It seems scary to think that we have such little control. And oftentimes, even if we actively try to escape an abusive relationship because we saw, that's what our parents modeled for us, we end up in that position anyways, because that's what we saw modeled. And just like Lily's mom was justifying the abuse and staying with her dad, Lily found herself doing the same thing. And I think that was really painful for her. And that was one of the most heartbreaking parts of the story, was seeing her see those similarities to her and her mom and how she was falling into the pattern that was modeled for her.
Yeah, I agree with what Haley just said, literally, verbatim. Yeah, I do see it more being like, well, and I think in Lily's case, like, yeah, she saw it all growing up. So she almost prided herself in a way. Like, I'm not going to be like my mom. My mom is weak. If a man hit me, I would have left, until you're in that situation, right? And I do think that's why she took forever to go to her mom, because she figured, well, my mom's going to tell me to stay, right? Because my mom stayed. And I do think the book actually does like portray also like this like two generation, like how these two women both in the same situation, but I do feel like her mother felt like she had to stay, right? Because that's just what you did, in that generation and in their small town. Whereas Lily was more like, oh yeah, I can leave. I have the courage to leave, and I'm gonna do that. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what else to say, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
I think also on the side of post-traumatic growth, it doesn't always end up that way. Like, from a positive psychology point of view, that's kind of how this idea of post-traumatic growth came to be, is that there are some anomalies where we would predict in one case that this child growing up in these conditions would have PTSD and fall into really harmful trauma patterns. But it actually ends up the opposite, where they thrive and they grow. And they're still doing research, because it's such a new kind of field of psychology, to really identify the characteristics within the person that determine that. So resiliency is one of the big ones that they've found, that if a person is really resilient and they're born with a high level of that naturally, then they will be able to fall into a pattern of post-traumatic growth easier than someone else. And that's not to say that they're better. It's just kind of falls into your genetic makeup and the nature versus nurture thing.
Yeah. Dang, that is actually really interesting. I'm taking notes. Are y'all ready for another question? So in the book, we kind of see Lily pretty briefly, but we still do at the very end, some months later, and she like meets up with Atlas, and she has her little ending, and I really liked how that book ended. But in terms of kind of dealing with an abusive relationship after the fact, do you guys kind of have thoughts on that, on how it was portrayed in the book with Lily herself, or how in general people are able to like cope with it and kind of move on from their lives? Because that's obviously a very traumatic experience, and we kind of see her mom handle it a little bit differently than Lily herself. So just wanted to see your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, everyone that comes out of an abusive relationship would get counseling that suits their needs. Every individual is going to have different ways that they cope. And in a perfect world, they would get the counseling that would be suited to that. But that's not a reality a lot of times. I know the people that I see that are in domestic abuse situations or have come out of them and are trying to cope afterwards. I use a protocol called HEART, HEART. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's from the Hope Alliance, which is a women's shelter in Texas, or maybe it's nationwide. I'm not sure, but I know it's a Texas thing. And it's a 12-step program to teach women how to embrace their survivor part of their soul rather than the victim part. So before we can become a survivor, we have to acknowledge the victimhood and accept that these experiences happened to me. And then as we move through the steps, there's a lot that goes into it. But I think some of the most important ones are not necessarily processing the abuse, but the later steps that are more solution focused and deal with, okay, how can I prevent this moving forward? How do I identify the red flags in this relationship so I make sure I don't end up here again?
Yeah, I agree with that, especially the like what you just said, Haley, about like how can I not end up here again? Because I do think in what I've seen in my clients that have had domestic abuse happen to them like a long time ago and processing it, they do not trust people easily, and that's the thing is like what Haley was talking about is like, processing it and being able to like again open your heart or whatever to another relationship, but that goes with like you need to process what happened and all the emotions that are tied between it, because there's so many, right? Because you're just like, why did this have to happen to me? I don't trust people, because this happened to me, this will happen in all my relationships. And yeah, I just think taking that time to really explore that is really like effective.
And it's kind of like grief in that way, where there's so many different emotions and they're really closely related. Like there can be a sense of loss of the relationship, but there's also anger and resentment. And processing all of that is really difficult. But like you said, it's really necessary to go through every piece of that. And with the trust, something I've emphasized with, I'm thinking of one particular client who's very close to my heart. We've been working on her trust through agency. And that's a really big word for her, to conceptualize that she has power to give trust. And inherently within her trust, she has this agency to give and also take it away. So now she is not this victim where things are just happening to her, but she has the agency to choose what happens to her. And if something happens to her and she ends up in this abusive situation again, she has that agency to get herself out.
I really like that idea of being able to kind of look at it as something you can give and take away rather than something someone else is doing to you. Because you're right, it does give you a lot of like power.
That's a really good question, Amanda. It is a cycle, kind of like what we were talking about earlier. These patterns are set for you. And that's unfortunately a really common thing that occurs.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way that, Lily differs from her mom in the way that she gets herself out is really key there. Like Emily, what you were talking about earlier about the generational difference, especially with her mom living in a small town and that not really being acceptable. Lily didn't really have those factors. So it really is individual. Okay, yeah. So it's not just a sad coincidence. It kind of, the stage is set when you witness abuse. It is traumatic. And that is a pattern that is set for you that you're going to live out. As much as we don't like it, we do live out the patterns that our parents set for us unless we actively unlearn them and we practice that awareness. And it's unique in this book because Lily was really aware. She was really not wanting to end up like her mom. And she still, unfortunately, did end up in that situation and played out that pattern. And I think it took a lot of strength and awareness on her part to say, not only am I going to set this boundary where if he does this again, I'm leaving, but I'm not just going to keep pushing that boundary. Mm-hmm. Because I think she did that a little bit. And it's a very common thing that happens, okay, as long as he doesn't hit me in the face, that's fine. As long as I can hide the injuries, that's fine. But if he injures my face, that's when we're going to have a problem. Well, if the abuse escalates to that point, usually what will happen is the boundary will get pushed and pushed and pushed. Lily didn't. And I think that piece of awareness clued in where she goes, okay, I'm in this pattern. And she had that realization that she was acting out exactly like her mom did, those justifications. And that awareness was the key for her getting out.
Y'all think it's, obviously a lot of her awareness, at least from what I kind of gathered, was just being able to see that pattern in her mom and her dad. But for those who, I guess this is a two-part question. But one, how likely is it that someone who was not brought up in an abusive environment could then later on find themselves in that situation or unfortunately be the abuser themselves? So I guess we can answer that question first, and then I can kind of tie it back into what I was saying earlier.
Do you want to take this one first, Emily? I don't want to dominate all the answers.
You can take this one because I honestly, I don't have an answer.
For me, I think it comes down to individual differences. Yeah. Anyone, unfortunately, can fall into the trap of an abusive relationship. It's happened to me. It's happened to Emily. I've never experienced physical abuse, but unfortunately, I think a lot of women have experienced abuse, whether that's emotional abuse, manipulation, gaslighting. I think that's just a pretty common occurrence. Everybody knows someone or has been the person that has experienced that. And I think the way that you can navigate that situation varies on and the patterns that were modeled to you by your parents. But that last part of your question that talks about becoming an abuser themselves, all kind of traumatic events or non-traumatic just events that you live through can lead to intense aggression that you take out on other people, or even a dissociation where you're in this aggressive state and maybe you're not aware of it. And then it's followed up by that extreme apologetic, kind of state. And that doesn't have to be from witnessing abuse growing up. I think that's just, like in Ryle's situation where he had that extremely traumatic experience with his brother. That can definitely form those really negative patterns if he internalized that trauma and never dealt with it and processed the kind of leftover stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, Amanda, are y'all seeing this question in the chat? That's hard.
They will have to go to therapy. I think that is the only way an actual abuser will change, especially if you're talking about physical abuse. What I have been told is they need to do about 6 months of work with dealing with their violent behaviors, because I do think it is it's hard and it's a long process to switch from, you know, whether it's like emotional abuse or verbal abuse, and most of those go hand in hand. And so switching that behavior is hard and not an easy fix.
Yeah. I think it's a good example at the end of the book when Ryle and Lily are working on their co-parenting relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You see how Ryle is learning to cope with his tendencies. So he's accepted that he is this way. He has the awareness in the moment that he is being violent, where he brought in his brother-in-law to kind of be a witness and pull him away. That's a really extreme form of coping, but if that's what he needed to be there in that conversation, I think an abuser can definitely cope in that way. Change, that's asking a lot, and it's going to take a lot of work. But I think it's possible in therapy. I just personally wouldn't want to be the partner waiting around for that change to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great questions, Amanda.
Yeah.
Okay, let me think about how I want to phrase this next one. So with Lily, we kind of saw that because she grew up with, you know, the parents that she had, and she was kind of able to pick up on the things her mom did, and that's kind of how she gained that awareness. Do you think that, oh gosh, I don't know how to ask this. Okay. Do you think it's possible for someone to kind of have that awareness, not having been brought up in an abusive environment at home, in their future relationships? And do you also kind of have any thoughts on how Lily was able to so prominently be that aware, when I know a lot of people aren't, even though they have been brought up in abusive relationships?
Do you have a response?
You go first, Haley. Let me think. Because that's a loaded question.
I know.
Let me take a minute. Okay.
I'm trying to think about how to phrase this in a way that is not too, you know, just saying everybody's different. I think that Lily was so actively trying to not be her mother.
Yeah.
That's where that awareness came from. And I think if you're blinded by, you know, if your mom really shields you from the abuse and she really convinces you that, you know, dad's just drunk and he just does this when he's drunk, or no, this is fine. I'm fine. I know you saw him hurt me, but look, I'm fine right now. And you don't have that deep-seated feeling of, I will not become my mother. I think it's really difficult then to get yourself out of an abusive situation and gain that awareness. I think it would even be, in that case, likely that that child would find themselves in an abusive relationship later in life. Because I think Lily's mom did a good job of saying, you know, this is wrong. I know that I'm staying here and I know that it's wrong. And I don't think that that happens in every parent abusive relationship. Yeah, that's really hard. And I mean, it's so hard to say, how are you supposed to see the signs? I don't think you're supposed to.
Yeah.
If you grow up not knowing how abuse works and then you're caught in this situation, it can be really hard to gain the awareness and say, I need to get myself out now. This has reached a point where it's inappropriate. Although if you are raised by truly great parents who teach you boundaries, I don't think that would be as
Okay, I'll throw out another question. So in terms of people kind of being on the outside looking in, do you think that Atlas himself kind of reacted in a similar way to how most people would if they kind of noticed someone they know might be in an abusive relationship? Because he kind of did say, like, this is wrong, like, you're kind of putting yourself in that exact position that your mom was in, like, you should know. And I personally felt like he could have done a little bit more. But I don't know if that's just me or if this is just how people react in the moment when they see their friend or family member kind of potentially be in that situation. So just kind of how people should react or do react when they know someone who is kind of giving off that.
So I do think Atlas, speaking of because he's a male, okay, so I think his reaction is pretty typical. I think especially if you have never experienced this in your life, it's so easy to judge a person. Well, this happened in your mom's relationship and you pride yourself on like not being like her, but you're in the situation. So but it's also like I said earlier, once you're in a situation like this, it's so hard for them to leave. Right. And that's what was going on with Lily is he's not my dad. Like he blah, blah. Like he's not my dad. He doesn't beat me as often as my dad did my mom. But I think what should happen if like a friend or a loved one is in the situation is you honestly just listen to them, like, and don't really place your judgment, because honestly doing that is probably more harmful because they will start keeping it in and they will say, I cannot tell this person because they're going to judge me for it and they're going to want me to leave. I really do think the victim has to have that courage to leave on their own. And just really like listening to them. And then, I mean, if they ask for advice, yes, always be like, hey, if you ever need, like kind of what Atlas ended up doing, here's my phone number. When something goes wrong, like call me. I think that's a good way to go about it. But I do think it is typical for people to place judgment on the victim.
The phone number, that was the best way that Atlas showed up for her.
Yep.
That removed sort of support where you put it in the victim's hands. That is the best way to help someone in an abusive situation. If you do more, and like you said, Sahar, you felt like he should have done more. We all want to do more. For my clients that are in this situation, I always talk about this with my supervisor. I want to do more. I know that I'm helping them by providing them therapy, but I want to drive to their house and tell them, get in the back, we're getting out of here. Like, I'm going to stay with you. And that's just going to create more dependency in the victim relationships. And that's what we're trying to break. Once they get themselves out, that's when they know, I have the worth. My worth doesn't depend on this man or this abuser. I have the worth and the agency to remove myself. So him giving her that phone number, that was the best thing he could have done, because it gave her an out to take advantage of herself.
Yeah.
And that part just gave me goosebumps when she was like, I memorized it. Even though he took it out, like, and I don't have it, I memorized it. Like, you just knew
Yeah.
that she knew that he was there for her.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's even harder when the victim is not aware
Yeah.
of the abuse, because then when you try to help them, it's going to feel insulting. It's going to feel like judgment, especially if they have that perfect relationship on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, you're totally right, Amanda. And it can actually help, you know, towards the abuser's mission of isolation when a partner's friends are really, really against him. This is a very heteronormative conversation, but that's fine. Abusers come in all types of relationships and in all genders, but in this situation, since it's a heterosexual relationship in the book, they're driving the victim towards the abuser sometimes when they really are going hard against them, saying, you know, get out of this, he's bad for you, da 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 da. It can really drive her towards him in a lot of situations.
So I guess, if you kind of know someone and you think that they could potentially be in an abusive relationship, but they haven't, told you, or they haven't really shared that, or maybe they're not even kind of aware of that themselves, how do you go about helping them in that situation? Because obviously you're not just going to sit down and be like, hey, I know you're, so like what do you do in that situation?
Build them up.
Yep.
Emphasize their agency,
yep,
and their worth separate from their partner. Even it can be really subtle as, oh, remember when you used to be really passionate about your art? God, I really miss that about you. It seems like you're not doing that anymore. And then that will make them think, oh yeah, you're right. He's taking me away from this part of myself that I used to love. Or because I'm in this situation and I'm always worried about being abused, all of a sudden I don't have the energy to dedicate to the things that I love. Just pulling that awareness out of the victim and saying, there's a difference. There has been a shift in your relationship, and you have the strength and the ability to get yourself out.
Yeah. I think, along with that, I think also from my clients that have dealt with this, I talk about boundaries. That was a huge thing with one of my clients that actually just got out of one. They were not physical, but they were emotional abuser. And my client did not know anything about boundaries. And she felt like, they had to kind of always respond to them. And just, I do think highlighting that, like, no, like silence is good to use and all that stuff. And I also do think, I think Haley mentioned this earlier, kind of, and I know it mentions in the book, but kind of this like whole the threshold, right, of being like, when is this going to be enough for you? Like, when is it where you're going to like, you will leave, and you will like, and most of the time they're going to keep pushing it back, but there might be sometimes that they're like, if they, punch me instead of slap me, like, I will leave. So I do think, but I also think, building them up is the most important part.
And just offering that removed support, saying, hey, you know how to get to my house from your house, right? You don't need directions. You know that you can come to my house at 2 a.m. and I'll be there, right? Just subtle things like that, where you're not saying, I know what's happening here and I want you out. but you're saying, I am here to support you, whether you want to stay or you want to leave, which I think that's really painful, especially if the victim is someone you love. Say that you will support them, even if you are seeing them stay with the abuser, but that is really essential. They need your support no matter what decision they make, because as soon as you convince them to leave, you're going against their agency, and that's what you're trying to build up. Hello, new people in the chat. What's up, Ryan? Emily and I are colleagues. We are therapists in training. Sahara is our facilitator. Go subscribe to her at Basically Reads.
Oof. I have a lot of opinions on that. First of all, it makes me sad. I do think no matter like how long your friend is in this, relationship, I mean, I had a roommate in college, essentially, that was in a relationship like this, and I was pretty like at first at the beginning, obviously was like, hey, I don't think like this is like all right, but like was still giving her, like, I'm not judging you for staying with him. This is your relationship, right? But also, I think I took a back seat. But it's also like you're loving them from afar, right? And letting them know, like, hey, if you still need anything, let me know. Because I do think friends that are just like, whatever, I'm done, I'm leaving. It's just like they're getting frustrated due to their own beliefs, right? Because it's like, well, if I was in this situation, I would have left already. And a friend that is in an abusive relationship, that's the last thing they need to hear.
Yeah, I second all of that. And I think what you said about that frustration, that's really important, because it really is the friend's own frustration that's causing them to leave. And that's really painful for the victim.
Yeah.
And it can feel more isolating as well. This piece of it, you're in a bad situation, I don't want to be a part of it. I think that's valid in some senses. I had a client who was talking about it was really difficult for her to see one of her friends going through an abusive relationship, and she couldn't stand to be around her and witness the boyfriend hurting her best friend. So she did that kind of removed support, where she said, you have my number, you have a crisis number, you know how to get to me, I love you and I will be here for you. But for herself, my client, for her own mental health, could not, hang out with her and witness that. It was harming her. So I think that's where a lot of the leaving comes in. And I think there's a difference between, leaving and cutting off a friend and saying, this is really hard for me to watch. I will support you from afar, like you said. Hello, Hannah. I'm glad you could catch a live. Yeah, I bet you kind of could relate to what we were saying about that frustration. It is really hard to watch. Thank you, Ryan, for subscribing. Ryan's in all my lives. He's always trying to get me to read Carry On Comfort. It's not going to happen. But if you work on Sahara, she might actually read it. She's a fan. She likes big, thick books.
I do.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
Oh.
Any more questions for us?
Those were all the ones that I had.
All right. Any questions from the chat? If not, thank you for watching. We'll stay on just a couple minutes. If there are any more questions, last minute questions you have, go ahead and type them and send them in. Wow, we've been talking about this book for an hour. That's a long time. Thank you guys
So
for the
good.
questions that you sent in, and thank you, Sahar, for being here and coming up with your wonderful questions and facilitating.
Of course. I'm glad y'all liked the book.
Yeah, and I was telling Haley, I was like, I think every therapist should read this book. I mean, I think everyone should read this book because it does put in such a different light on abusive relationships, and how it's like, you know, you don't know unless like you're in it. And I do think, you know, Haley and I both have talked about this. We have a better understanding of our clients that are in situations like this or that have been in situations like this.
Yeah. And even just people in my life
Yeah.
that I've known in abusive relationships, it's really helped me understand why they stayed for so long. Because, you know, even as a therapist, like there's therapist Haley, but then there's also human Haley who has a lot of that frustration and stuff that comes in. So this was a great reminder of that. And I also think, you know, the end of the book, when the us of it ends with us,
Yeah.
that like gave me goosebumps, because you obviously think it ends with, you know, us as in a relationship. And when you're talking about her child and how the cycle stops here, I thought that was so powerful. And Colleen Hoover is just a genius for this one. She really, sometimes she's not a genius, but for this one, she deserves an applause.
Yeah. This is also my first and only Colleen Hoover book I've read.
Mine too.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, y'all need to read Verity.
That's
I have it.
November 9 and Verity. Those are like, they hit different.
I have Verity staring at me on my shelf, so
what do you
Let's finish this first.
Oh no. See, Ryan, I told you she likes chunky books. Well, my fiance just got home. Thank you guys in the chat for being here. Love you all. Thanks for coming. And Emily and Sahar, thank you for being on my channel.
Thank you for having me. Like, I enjoyed it.
Well, I'm glad we had this discussion. Let me know on like my community tab and stuff like that if you want me to do these kind of therapist POV discussions with different books. DM me on Instagram if you have a specific book in mind. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.
Bye.